There's a specific kind of pain that doesn't have a clean name. It's not grief exactly. It's not depression exactly. It's the feeling of waking up one day and realizing that the person you thought you were, the one with the plan, the one holding it together, the one who knew what they wanted, has quietly stopped existing, and in their place is nothing. Just a hollow space where a self used to be. You don't tell people about this, because how do you explain that you're not sad about something? You're sad about everything, and also, somehow nothing. How do you explain that the things that used to work, the things that used to make you feel like yourself, have stopped working completely? That you've tried and tried again, and the trying itself has become exhausting. So you do what most people do. You interpret it. You call it burnout. You call it a rough patch. You tell yourself you just need rest, or a change, or more discipline. And underneath all of that, quietly, you believe something darker. That you are breaking down. That this is what falling apart looks like. That you are losing. Jung would tell you that you have misread everything. In the winter of 1913, Carl Jung sat at his desk and made a deliberate decision that he believed might destroy him. He had just broken from Freud, the man who had been his mentor, his intellectual father, his entry point into the entire field. He was disoriented, professionally isolated, and living under what he described as a constant inner pressure so intense he suspected he was developing psychosis. His dreams were apocalyptic. His inner life had become a place he no longer recognized. By every measure available to him, he was in collapse. He descended anyway. He called it his confrontation with the unconscious, a voluntary surrender to the chaos inside him, a deliberate plunge into everything he could not explain or control. It lasted years, and from that darkness, that period of total disorientation and psychological near-destruction, emerged the entire architecture of analytical psychology. The shadow, the individuation process, the archetypes, everything Jung ever built came from the place that looked, from the outside, like a man falling completely apart. He wasn't falling apart, he was in transformation, and he could not have known the difference in the middle of it, only after. This is what Jung discovered, through himself and through decades of work with patients. The psyche does not change gradually. It does not evolve through comfort or slow improvement. It transforms through crisis, through the total collapse of what you were, so that what you actually are can finally emerge. And the most dangerous moment in that process is not the beginning of the darkness. It is the end of it, because the end looks identical to the beginning, and most people give up there. There are 7 specific signs that you are not collapsing. You are completing something, and if you can learn to read them, everything changes. Here is what no one tells you about the coping strategies you've built. They were never solving the problem. They were managing the distance between you and the problem. Work you couldn't stop doing. Relationships you stayed in too long. The drink, the scroll, the obsessive planning, the constant motion. None of it was healing anything. It was keeping something at bay. And for a while, that was enough. Then it stopped working. Not gradually, not in a way you could negotiate with. One day, the thing that always took the edge off simply didn't. You went back to the well, and it was dry. You tried harder, and felt worse. The mechanism that had quietly run your life for years, maybe decades, jammed. And in the silence that followed, everything you had been keeping at bay was still there, waiting. Jung would say the psyche engineered this deliberately. The unconscious is not passive. It does not sit quietly while you outrun it. When the gap between who you are performing and who you actually are becomes too wide, the psyche begins dismantling the infrastructure that maintains that gap. It breaks the tools, not as punishment, as demand. A demand that you finally stop managing the distance and close it. The collapse of your coping mechanisms is not a sign that you are getting worse. It is a sign that the old method of surviving has been revoked, because something in you requires more than survival now. This is also when the second sign appears, and it is the one that frightens people most. The things you buried start coming back. The anger you decided wasn't acceptable. The grief you never finished. The version of yourself you were ashamed of. The needy one. The furious one. The one who wanted things you convinced yourself you didn't want. They surface through dreams you can't shake, through reactions that feel disproportionate, through a creeping sense that you are becoming someone you don't recognize. You call it losing control. Jung called it the shadow returning for integration. The shadow is not your worst self. It is every part of yourself you decided was unacceptable and pushed below the surface. It does not disappear when you reject it. It accumulates. And at a certain point in transformation, the psyche refuses to keep it submerged any longer. What emerges feels like chaos. What it actually is the rest of you, demanding to be included. Jung wrote that the man who looks outward dreams, and the man who looks inward awakens. This is what inward looks like in practice. Not peaceful, not enlightened, messy, destabilizing, and deeply uncomfortable, because you are being forced to see what you spent years learning not to see. If your coping mechanisms have collapsed, and the parts of you that you've suppressed are surfacing without warning, you are not unraveling. You are in the early stage of becoming whole. And what comes next goes even deeper, because the psyche doesn't just break your tools and surface your shadow. It begins speaking to you in a language most people have forgotten how to read. If this content is making sense to you, click the subscribe button and subscribe to the channel. Thank you for your support. The self you are trying to protect does not exist the way you think it does. This is not a philosophical provocation. It is a description of what happens when you look directly at what you call I and try to locate it. Watts, drawing from both Buddhist inquiry and direct observation, notice something that most people spend their entire lives avoiding. The self is not a thing. It is a process, a river, not a rock. And everything you have built around the assumption that it is permanent, every identity, every self-concept, every story about who you are, is a convention imposed on something that was never fixed to begin with. Consider what you actually find when you try to observe the I. You find thoughts, feelings, sensations, memories, each one arriving, existing briefly, dissolving. The sense of a continuous self watching all of this is itself just another thought, a rapid sequence of experiences that memory stitches into the illusion of a stable observer. Watts put it precisely. Consciousness is not a tablet upon which life writes a record. It is the river flowing along with the writing. You are not the same person you were 10 years ago, not just philosophically, biochemically, psychologically, structurally. The body you inhabit has replaced nearly every cell. The beliefs you held have shifted. The things that frightened you have changed. And yet you carry this feeling of being a continuous, coherent I that has simply moved through time unchanged. That feeling is the convention. The change was the reality all along. Here is where this becomes personally dangerous. When you identify completely with a fixed version of yourself, I am this kind of person. I have always been this way. This is who I am. You are not describing yourself. You are imprisoning yourself. You are taking something fluid and dynamic and insisting it stay still. And then you suffer, not because life is cruel, but because life keeps moving and you keep demanding that it doesn't. The person who says, "I've always been anxious," is not reporting a fact. They are maintaining a story. The person who says, "I'm not the kind of person who changes," is not being honest about themselves. They are defending a construction. Watts would say that the tragedy is not that people can't change. It is that they have mistaken a temporary pattern for a permanent truth, and now they protect that mistake as if it were their identity. And they do protect it. Fiercely, because if the self is not fixed, if who you are right now is just one temporary configuration of something always in motion, then the ground disappears. There is nothing solid to stand on. That terror is real. But Watts asks you to look at it differently. The ground was never there. What you called ground was always just water moving slowly enough to seem still. The terror of that recognition is not a sign that something is wrong. It is the sensation of finally seeing clearly. A self that is not fixed cannot be permanently broken, cannot be permanently defined, cannot be permanently trapped. If you are a process rather than a thing, then no failure is final. No identity is a cage. No version of yourself is the last word on who you are. The freedom Watts is pointing to is not freedom from change. It is the freedom that comes from finally being what you actually are, which is change itself. But recognizing this intellectually is not enough. There is another layer to this, one most people find even harder to face. What happens when the change is painful? What happens when the moment you are in is not one you want? That is where we are going next, into the part of Watts's argument that cuts deepest. At some point during this process, you stopped showing up the way you used to, cancelled plans, let messages go unanswered, withdrew from people who couldn't understand what was happening, which was everyone, because you couldn't explain it yourself. And you've probably told yourself one of two things, that you're being antisocial, or that you're depressed, or that you should force yourself back out there before you disappear completely. Jung would tell you to stop forcing it. The withdrawal is not avoidance. It is incubation. There is a specific kind of internal work that cannot happen in noise, that gets interrupted by the presence of other people's needs, other people's energy, other people's versions of who you are supposed to be. The psyche knows this. When transformation is underway, it pulls you inward with a gravity that feels like depression, but operates differently. Depression empties you. This kind of solitude fills you, slowly, invisibly, in ways you won't be able to measure until the process is complete. Jung himself disappeared during his confrontation with the unconscious. He retreated from public life, from colleagues, from the professional world he had built. He spent hours alone at the lakeshore, building stone structures like a child, writing down fantasies he couldn't yet understand, sitting with an inner life that had become more real to him than anything outside. It looked, from the outside, like a man who had lost his footing. It was actually a man allowing something to form in the silence that could not have formed anywhere else. If you have withdrawn, and the withdrawal feels necessary even when it frightens you, trust the necessity. The self that is emerging needs the quiet to take shape. Forcing yourself back into social performance right now is not recovery. It is interruption. But solitude is not the only sign. There is a sixth one, and it operates differently, not through absence, but through a strange surplus of meaning. The coincidences have been happening too often. You think of someone, and they call. You reach a breaking point, and the exact book, conversation, or stranger appears with the exact thing you needed to hear. You make a decision in the dark, and the external world rearranges itself around that decision in ways that feel impossible to explain. You've been calling it coincidence because coincidence is the only word available. Jung gave it a different name: synchronicity. Synchronicity is not magic. It is not the universe rewarding you. Jung defined it as the meaningful coincidence of an inner event and an outer one. Two things that have no causal connection but carry unmistakable significance when they meet. And what he observed, across decades of clinical work and in his own life, was that synchronicities cluster around moments of deep psychological transformation. The more aligned you are with your own individuation process, the more the inner and outer worlds seem to rhyme. This is not something to analyze, it is something to register. The next time it happens, and it will, write it down. Not to decode it, not to post it, just to acknowledge that something is moving in you that is large enough to leave marks on the world around you. That act of witnessing, Jung believed, accelerates the process. It makes the unconscious legible to the conscious mind. And the legibility is what allows integration to begin. You have withdrawn. The coincidences are multiplying. The silence has become strangely inhabited. These are not symptoms of someone falling behind. They are the conditions under which the final and most confronting sign appears. The one that most people cannot name, but almost everyone in transformation eventually feels. If what you're hearing resonates with you, you'll find real value in my ebooks. Beyond the Shadow breaks down Jung's core ideas, while Dialogues with the Unconscious gives you a 30-day path to apply them in your life. Both are linked in the pinned comment. There is something in you that is dying. You know this not because someone told you, not because you read it somewhere, but because you can feel it. The way you can feel a season changing before the temperature actually drops. Something that used to be central to who you are has gone quiet in a way that feels permanent. And the strangest part, the part you haven't said out loud to anyone, is that somewhere underneath the terror, you know it needs to go. That knowing is the seventh sign, and it is the most important one. Most of the pain in this process comes not from the dying itself, but from the resistance to it. The ego, the constructed self, the identity you have spent your entire life assembling and defending, does not surrender quietly. It fights. It generates narratives about why you cannot let go, why this particular thing must be preserved, why losing this part of yourself would mean losing everything. It mistakes the structure for the person. It cannot distinguish between the shell and what lives inside it. Jung watched this pattern repeat across every patient who came to him mid-transformation. The ones who suffered longest were not the ones whose lives had fallen apart most severely. They were the ones who kept trying to put the same structure back together, who grieved the old self so completely that they had no energy left to become the new one, who treated the death of their identity as a catastrophe rather than a passage. And it is a passage, not a metaphor, a literal psychological movement from one form of self to another. The alchemists called the full sequence nigredo, albedo, rubedo, blackening, whitening, reddening, death, purification, new life. They were not describing mystical processes, they were mapping what happens to the human psyche under the pressure of genuine transformation. You do not skip stages, you do not negotiate with them, you move through them in sequence, and the only variable is how long you resist each one. The moment Jung identified as the critical turning point was not the beginning of the descent. It was the moment the ego stopped fighting the dissolution and allowed it. Not passively, not with defeat, but with a recognition that what was dying had already served its purpose, and that clinging to it was costing more than releasing it. He described it as a kind of active surrender, conscious, deliberate, and terrifying in a way that felt completely different from the unconscious terror that had preceded it. If you are feeling that paradox right now, the grief of losing something and the quiet knowledge that it must be lost, you are standing at the exact threshold Jung described, not at the beginning of the darkness, at the end of it. This is the most dangerous moment in the entire process, not because anything terrible is about to happen, but because it doesn't feel like a threshold. It feels like the darkness has always been there and always will be. The exhaustion of having endured it this long makes the idea of enduring it one moment longer feel impossible. And so people leave. They make the impulsive decision, rebuild the old structure, return to the old relationship, abandon the process entirely. Not because they are weak, but because no one told them they were seconds from the other side. You are not in the middle of this. You are at the end of it. And the self that is about to emerge is not a repaired version of the one that collapsed. It is something that could only have been born from the collapse, something that required the full death of what came before it. The question is not whether you can endure what's coming. The question is what you do with what you now know. Stop trying to feel better. That is the first thing. Not because feeling better is wrong, but because everything you are currently doing to feel better is aimed at ending the process rather than moving through it. The distinction matters enormously. One leads out, the other leads back to the beginning. Jung was precise about this. The instinct during transformation is to stabilize, to find solid ground as quickly as possible, to reconstruct certainty, to make the disorientation stop. And every time you act on that instinct, you are rebuilding the structure that the psyche just finished dismantling. You are not recovering, you are resetting, and the process will begin again, because the psyche does not abandon what it has started. So here is what you do instead. Tonight, before you sleep, write down one thing that has been true about this period that you have not allowed yourself to say out loud. Not a feeling, a fact. Something that has ended, something that no longer works, something you have been pretending still holds. One sentence, unpolished, not for anyone else, just the fact, witnessed by you. This is what Jung called making the unconscious conscious, not through grand revelation, but through the small, deliberate act of refusing to look away. When the coping mechanism calls, and it will tonight or tomorrow, do not answer it automatically. Pause for 30 seconds first, not to resist it forever. 30 seconds. In those 30 seconds, ask yourself what you are trying not to feel. You do not have to feel it. You only have to name it. That gap between impulse and action is where the psyche begins to breathe. When the dreams come, write them down immediately. Not later, not a summary. The images, the feeling, the specific detail that seemed wrong or significant. You are not trying to interpret them. You are building a record of what your unconscious is processing, because patterns will emerge over days and weeks that are invisible in a single dream. Jung kept these records obsessively during his own descent. He called it the work. It is the work. When the synchronicity happens, and after this video, it will happen because you are now paying attention. Write that down too. The name that appeared, the sentence you heard, the thing that arrived exactly when you needed it. Not to prove anything, to register that the process has its own intelligence and that you are inside it. And when the pressure to make a major decision becomes unbearable, to end something, to start something, to define yourself before you are ready, wait. Not indefinitely, but long enough to ask whether this decision is coming from the new self that is emerging or from the old self that is trying to survive. Those two feel identical from the inside. The difference is that one decision contracts your life back to a familiar shape, and the other opens something you cannot yet see clearly but can feel. You will not do all of this perfectly. You will grab the coping mechanism. You will avoid the notebook. You will make one premature decision and have to find your way back. That is not failure. That is the actual texture of what Jung was describing. The process is not linear. It does not reward consistency. It rewards honesty. Every time you are honest about where you are, even once, even imperfectly, you move. That is the work. Not transformation as an event you arrive at. Transformation as something you participate in, one honest moment at a time. And everything you've heard in this video, the signs, the symbols, the dying and the waiting, it has already changed the way you are reading your own life. You cannot unhear it, which means something has already shifted. And where that leads is something no checklist can predict, but that the next part of this process has been asking you toward all along. Here is the hardest truth of everything you've just heard. Most people who have lived through what you are living through right now did not make it to the other side. Not because they weren't capable, not because the transformation wasn't real, but because they reached this exact point, exhausted, disoriented, carrying the weight of a self that had already died but not yet been replaced. And they chose the exit. They rebuilt the old structure. They went back. They decided that the darkness was permanent because it had lasted long enough to feel that way. They gave up in the final hour, and they spent the rest of their lives wondering why the same collapse kept finding them. Jung was unsparing about this. He saw it repeat across patient after patient. The person who had done the most difficult work, survived the most destabilizing period, arrived at the threshold of genuine transformation, and then retreated back into the familiar, because the unfamiliar was taking too long. He called it the great tragedy of the unfinished process. Not that people suffered, but that they suffered completely and collected nothing from it. The agony without the integration, the death without the rebirth. You are not obligated to repeat that pattern. What individuating means, what Jung meant when he used that word, is not becoming enlightened. It is not arriving at a permanent state of clarity or peace. It is becoming more fully what you actually are, as opposed to what you were constructed to be. It is the difference between a life built around avoiding what you fear and a life built around what survives when everything you feared losing is finally gone. That life is quieter than the one you imagined. It is less impressive in the ways you were trained to want to be impressive. And it is the only life that will not eventually collapse under its own inauthenticity, because it is not built on inauthenticity anymore. The self that is emerging from this process is not the self you lost. It is not a better version of the self you lost. It is something that could not have existed before the loss. Something that required the full weight of everything you've been through to become possible. You could not have reasoned your way here. You could not have planned your way here. The only path to this specific place was through exactly what you've been surviving. That does not make the surviving easier, but it makes it mean something. And here is what that meaning asks of you now. Do not rush the final step. Do not decide who you are before you know. Do not fill the silence with noise because the silence has become uncomfortable. You have come too far to trade the real thing for a convincing imitation of it. The dawn is not announced, it arrives, and the only way to miss it is to stop waiting for it one moment too soon. Leave a comment below with one word that describes where you are in this process right now. Not an explanation. One word. You will find that word more honest than anything you've said about this out loud. And you may find, reading what others leave, that the darkness you assumed was yours alone has been shared by more people than you can imagine. The work that began in this video does not end here. Something has been set in motion inside you that this single sitting could not complete, and was never meant to. There is more to face, more to understand, more of Jung's map to follow into the parts of yourself you haven't turned toward yet. When you're ready, keep going. The next step is already waiting.